When analysing the written data, I collected lots of data. I collected over 30 interviews, diary entries, informal conversations with students, and it was about, well, how do I go about then synthesising that and working that into an answer for the research question I had set. I knew from the start that you have to have some kind of framework. You have to have a framework that's come from the literature. So I had a framework, there's points I was going to look at. So in this framework, what I was doing was picking out key parts that contributed to answering the question. What happened after that is I collected the data, lots of interviews, collected data from a year-long study. For the type of study I was doing, I used Miles and Huberman's qualitative analysis framework, which allowed me to understand how I was going to develop patterns out of the data. So that helped me to immerse myself in the data. So I immersed from an approach of analysing the cases I had, synthesising them and grouping them against the framework. However, Miles and Huberman talk about data display, and for me, the data display that they talked about was obviously using lots of matrices, and again it's a bit too structured, and I really couldn't. I got to the point where I was totally immersed in the data. I knew what it said, but it didn't really still connect. I couldn't really form an answer. So I kind of took the data display to another level. I remember sitting on a bus, going home one day, and I just started to think about the conclusions that I'd reached from just that immersion in the data. I had a set of things that had come out and conclusions drawn. And I was saying, what are the relationships between these? Although it doesn't really seem that much, I actually just started to think about and map out the conclusions on a sticker, and I just started to work out, well, what's the patterns between all of the conclusions, and that kind of led me to, well, I'm starting to see just from drawing on the post-it note that was actually changing, and then I started to do figure sketches. And I started to develop models of bigger sketches of what was actually happening in my data just from the conclusions that I had drawn. So I started to sketch this out and form models, and I actually started to put people in these models because people are very central to the research question. And so I started to do more mapping, more formal mapping, and then this reached to the point of doing more formal maps so that I could actually communicate the conclusions with peers and with my supervisors. So what you've got in this map in particular is I had my statements of my findings underneath here, and I wrote them down for each one. So that's statement 1, 2 and 3. And this map was one of the maps that I kept from one of the conversations I had. So they had developed from the sketches, and all these kind of notations on this were actually conversations that were had during the course of showing it to other people. And what actually happened is I had the statements when I showed it to the people. I had the statements that were the statements 1 and 2, which relates to here. I had literally we talk through them in relation to the diagrams. And that had an effect on actually changing their thoughts on what they understood of my research, and changed my thoughts, and the statements actually changed as we were going along. They said, do you not mean this, or is that statement not the same as another statement? And they start to kind of use it as well as synthesizing tool. So that started to come together, and then as we talked through this, the names of the models changed as well. Basically, taking that extra step of visualization for me enabled me to synthesize my thoughts. It enabled me to connect with the data in a way that I still felt immersed in it, but I didn't really feel connected to it. And it started to see new relationships, and it was a way of me engaging with the people in what was quite a complex subject area. I basically used the maps that I created, and I wrote the argument or the discussion around the maps, around the models that were created, and for me it made a much more succinct argument. If I didn't have their models, I didn't have their visuals, I think it would have been a lot more in-depth, but maybe the narrative wouldn't have gone through. I used mapping on a different occasion for, not for qualitative research, but for quantitative research, and I synthesised all of the standard deviations into one diagram. And again, that helped me to encourage other people to give feedback, and for me to synthesise what does this actually mean. And from producing their maps, changed the whole ontology of the thesis and changed the direction of how I view the subject. So I think it's been very powerful in that respect.